Imagine waking up before dawn in a freezing stone cottage, stomach growling, and all you've got is stale bread, if you're lucky. No eggs, no toast, no coffee, just hope. Tonight, Dust, we're peeling back the scratchy blanket on what mornings really looked like in medieval Europe. From peasant porridge to royal rations, you'll see why breakfast back then was more of a prayer than a meal. So get cozy and let's take a slow, sleepy walk through the hungriest part of the day. If you love falling asleep to strange but true slices of history that make your modern life feel extra comfy, you're exactly where you need to be. Subscribe and hit the bell icon to return each night for more tales that are dull in just the right way. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? It's always amazing to see how far our quiet little stories are reaching. Imagine waking up in medieval Europe around the year 1200, your stomach already aching with the familiar gnaw of morning hunger. You glance toward the cold hearth where last night's fire has died to ash, and you realize something that would seem impossible to modern minds. Breakfast simply doesn't exist. Not because there isn't food, though often there isn't, but because the very concept of eating in the morning has been branded as one of the gravest sins a person can commit. This wasn't an accident of circumstance or a quirk of medieval life. This was a deliberate, carefully constructed system of belief that transformed the most basic human need into a moral battleground. The absence of breakfast in medieval Europe wasn't just about food. It was about the fundamental restructuring of human desire itself. The Medieverse tells us that medieval Europeans typically ate only 2 meals per day: dinner, served at midday between noon and 2 p.m., and supper, served in the evening after the day's work was complete. But this wasn't simply a matter of convenience or agricultural scheduling. The Church had effectively weaponized hunger, turning the empty stomach into a symbol of spiritual purity. The theological foundation for this systematic starvation was laid by Thomas Aquinas and other church authorities who deemed eating breakfast as sinful, literally one of the 6 ways to commit the deadly sin of gluttony. The morning meal was seen as an indulgence of the flesh, a surrender to base desires that distracted the soul from its proper focus on God. Tasting history explains that the term breakfast itself, literally meaning to break the fast, reveals the religious undertones of morning abstinence. The night's sleep was considered a natural fast, and to break it voluntarily was to demonstrate spiritual weakness. But the reality was far more complex than simple religious doctrine. In the monasteries, where these rules were most strictly observed, monks did participate in a morning ritual called collations, small meals eaten before prayers, named after the collationes of John Cassian. The Medieverse notes that these collations were followed by readings from Cassian's work and prayers for forgiveness if gluttony had been committed. Even within the church's own walls, the human need for morning sustenance created complicated theological gymnastics. The contradiction became even more apparent when we consider the working classes. Peasants, laborers, and soldiers, the people whose physical exertion demanded the most energy, were the most likely to need morning food. Yet they were also the most bound by religious and social conventions that discouraged it. The Medieverse describes how indentured workers were sometimes given nuncheons, small snacks eaten during fast breaks before the main meals of dinner and supper. These weren't considered full meals, merely sustenance to prevent complete physical collapse. The wealthy, paradoxically, were more likely to eat something resembling breakfast. The Medieverse explains that employers with the means to have a meal ready at the early moments of the day generally had breakfast earlier than people who had to do everything themselves. The rich could afford servants to maintain fires through the night and prepare food at dawn, while the poor had to choose between using precious fuel for morning warmth or saving it for the essential cooking of their main meals. This created a society where hunger became a class marker. The ability to fast, to demonstrate spiritual superiority through physical denial, was actually a luxury that only the wealthy could afford to perform convincingly. The poor weren't choosing virtue when they skipped breakfast. They were simply surviving within the constraints of a system that had made their basic needs into moral failings. Military campaigns revealed the brutal practicality behind these religious ideals. The Medieverse notes that armies carried preserved foods like biscuits and salted meats, but breaking fast early in the day wasn't a necessary given for any soldier. Men marching to war, carrying weapons and armor across vast distances, were expected to begin their days on empty stomachs, not because it was militarily wise, but because their spiritual well-being was considered more important than their physical capability. The most revealing aspect of medieval breakfast culture wasn't what people ate, but who was allowed to eat at all. The Medieverse specifically mentions that breakfast was often given to the infant, the sick, and the elderly by caretakers to help regain and maintain strength. The very young, the very old, and the very ill were exempted from the moral requirement to fast, but this exemption itself reveals how unnatural the practice was. These were the people whose bodies most clearly demonstrated that morning hunger was a biological necessity, not a spiritual failing. Urban life added another layer of complexity to morning food culture. The Medieverse describes how, in the average household of medieval cities, it was the wife's job to go to the market almost every morning to get ingredients for the meals her family would have that day. Women were walking through streets filled with fresh food, negotiating for ingredients, handling and smelling provisions, all while maintaining the religious discipline of not eating until midday. This daily ritual created a peculiar psychological landscape where abundance and deprivation coexisted. Markets would be full of bread, cheese, fish, and vegetables at dawn, but the people shopping for these foods were forbidden from consuming them. The sensory experience of medieval morning life, the smell of baking bread, the sight of fresh produce, the sound of merchants calling their wares, must have been a form of daily torture for empty stomachs. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of medieval breakfast culture was how it normalized suffering. By transforming hunger from a problem to be solved into a virtue to be cultivated, medieval society created a framework where people were expected to be grateful for their deprivation. The empty stomach became a sign of spiritual achievement rather than social failure. The question that haunted every medieval morning wasn't simply, "What will I eat?" but, "Am I strong enough to resist eating?" This transformed the most private, intimate relationship that between a person and their body's needs into a public performance of moral worth. How do you measure hunger when admitting to it becomes an admission of spiritual weakness? The sun would rise over medieval Europe to illuminate a continent engaged in a collective performance of denial. But beneath the surface of religious orthodoxy, a complex underground economy of morning sustenance operated according to rules that had nothing to do with theology and everything to do with survival. Consider the reality of a peasant household in 12th century England. C.C. Renaissance Fair describes how the typical peasant dwelling would center around a single hearth, where keeping a fire alive through the night meant choosing between warmth and fuel conservation. The family would wake to find either glowing coals that could be coaxed back to flame, or cold ashes that meant starting fresh with precious tinder and kindling. When coals remained alive, there might be the possibility of what the Medieverse describes as leftovers from yesterday's supper, which had been kept warm next to the fire overnight. These weren't elaborate meals, but rather scraps of bread, remnants of porridge, or pieces of root vegetables that had been tucked near the hearth's edge. The family faced a daily calculation: consume these scraps now for immediate energy, or save them to augment the evening meal when hunger would be most severe. The physical experience of morning hunger in medieval times was profoundly different from modern understanding. C.C. Renaissance Fair explains that when peasants did eat something resembling breakfast, it consisted of dense and coarse loaf crafted from rye, barley, or oat flour, often days old and dark in colour. This bread wasn't the soft, fresh product we imagine, but a hard, nearly indestructible substance that required significant jaw strength to consume and provided sustenance through sheer caloric density rather than palatability. The brewing and consumption of small ale created its own morning rituals. C.C. Renaissance Fair notes that instead of water, which was often contaminated, families consumed small ale or small beer with minimal alcohol content that was believed to be more nourishing and safer than water. The original small beer describes how this mildly alcoholic drink was consumed for its hydrating and nutritional properties in households, workplaces, and even schools. This created the strange phenomenon of children beginning their days with alcohol, not for intoxication, but for hydration and calories. Imagine a 6-year-old medieval child, barely awake, drinking what was essentially weak beer because clean water was unavailable. The ale provided not just liquid, but also calories from the grain used in brewing, making it a crucial source of morning energy even when solid food was unavailable. Monastic communities revealed the true complexity of morning food restrictions. Historic Environment Scotland explains that each monk is allowed a pound of bread, along with a quarter litre of wine, but these rations were distributed across the entire day, not concentrated in morning consumption. The medieval monk describes how a basic monastic diet consisted of grains, legumes, bread, seasonal fruits and vegetables, but the timing of consumption was strictly regulated by religious observance. A writer's perspective provides crucial details about monastic morning routines. Monks had breakfast after the first Mass, between 7 and 8 a.m. Before each meal, they washed their hands in the lavatorium. This reveals that even within religious communities, some form of morning eating occurred, but it was carefully structured around prayer and purification rituals that emphasized the spiritual significance over the physical necessity. The seasonal dimension of morning hunger created additional layers of complexity. Medieval agricultural cycles meant that food availability fluctuated dramatically throughout the year. Medieval Wanderings describes how there were two main harvests in the Middle Ages. The first, earlier in summer, was when the hay was gathered in to feed the animals over winter. The main grain harvest didn't occur until August, meaning that spring and early summer represented months of depleted stores and increasing desperation. The food historian identifies March and April as the most dangerous time of year for eaters in northerly climes, when a poor harvest or improper storage could lead to catastrophic food shortages. During these months, the prohibition against morning eating became not just spiritually challenging, but physically dangerous. The preservation methods available to medieval households directly impacted morning food choices. Lives of the Past describes two key techniques: dry salting, where the meat or fish was buried in salt, and brine curing, where meat was soaked in salty water. Both methods produced food that was intensely salty and often required soaking or boiling before consumption, processes that demanded time, fuel, and water that might not be available for a quick morning meal. The social stratification of breakfast becomes even more apparent when examining the evidence from manor houses. Medieval Wanderings describes elaborate castle dining customs where places were marked with a trencher or manche, a thick slice of day-old bread that served as a plate for roasted meat. These trenchers, edible plates, represented a level of food abundance that allowed bread to serve as servingware rather than direct sustenance. But even among the wealthy, morning eating carried social complications. The discoverer explains that breakfasts gave lords of the manor the opportunity to showcase their wealth to visiting friends, family, and fellow landowners. Morning meals became performative displays of abundance, but they were also opportunities for religious and social transgression that required careful navigation. The gender dynamics of morning food preparation added another dimension to breakfast culture. Women were responsible for food procurement and preparation, but they were also subject to the same religious restrictions on morning eating. The Medieverse notes that wives would make daily market trips to acquire ingredients, meaning they were surrounded by food while maintaining their own fasts. This created a peculiar form of gendered labor, where women were expected to handle, prepare, and serve food while demonstrating the same spiritual discipline as men who didn't interact with ingredients directly. The woman who spent her morning kneading bread, tending cooking fires, and preparing meals was expected to exhibit the same level of morning abstinence as the man who simply waited for food to appear. The psychological impact of systematic morning hunger must have been profound. When the church declares that your body's most basic signal, hunger, is a temptation to sin, how does that reshape your relationship with your own physical existence? Medieval people learned to interpret hunger pangs not as biological information, but as spiritual tests, transforming every empty stomach into a moral examination. But what happened to the human capacity for morning productivity when an entire civilization decided that breakfast was optional? How did medieval workers, farmers, and craftsmen maintain the energy necessary for complex physical labor while beginning each day in a state of deliberate depletion? The great paradox of medieval morning culture wasn't that people avoided breakfast, it was that they accomplished extraordinary feats of physical and intellectual labor while systematically depriving themselves of morning nutrition. The cathedrals, castles, and complex agricultural systems that defined medieval Europe were built by workers who began each day with empty stomachs, and the belief that this emptiness made them spiritually superior. Archaeological evidence reveals the true cost of medieval breakfast culture on human bodies. E. Gullett describes skeletal remains that show medieval monks, despite having access to more food than peasants, suffered from nutritional deficiencies that would be shocking by modern standards. These were men who had dedicated their lives to spiritual discipline, including careful regulation of their eating habits, yet their bones reveal the physical price of their morning abstinence. The monastic records provide detailed insight into how religious communities manage the contradiction between spiritual fasting and physical necessity. E. Gullett describes a typical monastic morning schedule. 11 a.m., 1 p.m., 3 eggs, boiled or fried in lard, vegetable porridge with beans, leeks, carrots, and other produce of monastery garden, pork chops. By the time monks were permitted to eat, they were consuming calories equivalent to what modern nutritionists would recommend for an entire day, but concentrated into a few hours. This binge and restriction pattern created a form of metabolic stress that would have profound effects on both physical and mental performance. Medieval monasteries were centers of learning, manuscript copying, and complex administrative work, yet the men performing these tasks were operating in states of alternating starvation and excess that modern medicine would recognize as profoundly unhealthy. The agricultural implications of breakfast avoidance were equally significant. Witheridge Historical Archive explains that the main grain harvest began in early August if the weather allowed and would usually be completed by the end of the month. This meant that the most physically demanding work of the medieval year, cutting, gathering and processing grain crops, was performed by laborers who had been fasting since the previous evening. Harvest work required extraordinary physical exertion. A farmer's odyssey describes August activities as harvesting, tying, and threshing, while September involved harvesting, tying, winnowing, fruit picking, and milling. These tasks demanded sustained physical effort over 12 to 16-hour days, yet the people performing them were beginning each day without food. The seasonal nature of medieval hunger created additional complications for morning productivity. British food history describes how during famine periods, people were essentially reduced to a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, trapping wild animals and foraging for pig nuts, berries, and other wild foods. But even this foraging required early morning activity, the best time to find mushrooms, berries, and edible plants, performed by people who were already weakened by systematic food deprivation. Europe now explains that famine conditions included poor weather, failed harvests, and subsequent disruption, including high prices and deaths. During these crisis periods, the religious prohibition against morning eating became literally life-threatening, yet the Church maintained its theological position that breakfast remained a spiritual danger. The brewing industry reveals how medieval communities found creative solutions to morning nutrition restrictions. Small beer. Wikipedia describes how sometimes unfiltered and porridge-like small beer was a favored drink in medieval Europe precisely because it provided calories and nutrients while maintaining the fiction that people weren't eating. In the morning, Braciatrix provides technical details about medieval brewing. After the brewing process, I let the wort cool overnight, as per the instructions, and added my yeast in the morning. This timing meant that fresh, small beer was available each morning, providing a socially acceptable way to consume grain-based calories without technically breaking the morning fast. Ancestral Kitchen explains that medieval ale was made with home-malted and dehydrated rye and naked oat grains, making it essentially liquid porridge with alcohol content. The morning consumption of ale allowed medieval people to consume substantial nutrition while maintaining the religious fiction that they weren't eating breakfast. But the most revealing aspect of medieval breakfast culture was its class-based hypocrisy. Ian Visits notes that people didn't drink small beer to stay healthy, they drank small beer to give them energy. This energy was crucial for physical labor, yet the people who needed it most, peasants and workers, were also the most constrained by religious and social expectations about morning fasting. Tudor Times provides specific details about the class stratification of morning drinks. Small ale was weak and very bitter, appropriate for breakfast and daily consumption by workers, while stronger ales were reserved for evening consumption and higher social classes. The quality and strength of morning ale became a marker of social status, with the poor consuming weak, bitter drinks while the wealthy enjoyed stronger, more palatable beverages. The economic implications of medieval breakfast culture extended far beyond individual nutrition. Crescent City Brew Talk describes how medieval households would produce a strong ale with OG around 1.075 and a small beer with OG in the mid to upper 1.030s, requiring significant grain resources and brewing knowledge. Families had to allocate substantial agricultural output to brewing rather than direct food consumption, representing a massive economic inefficiency driven by religious ideology. Military records provide perhaps the clearest evidence of how breakfast restrictions impacted medieval productivity. Armies marching on empty stomachs, carrying heavy equipment across difficult terrain, were expected to maintain combat effectiveness while beginning each day in a state of nutritional depletion. The military success of medieval European armies in crusades, territorial expansion, and defensive campaigns was achieved despite systematic undermining of soldier nutrition. The intellectual achievements of medieval Europe are equally remarkable when considered in the context of morning hunger. The philosophical works of Thomas Aquinas, the architectural innovations of Gothic cathedrals, the complex administrative systems of emerging nations, all were developed by minds operating under the metabolic stress of deliberate morning fasting. Modern neuroscience reveals that cognitive function is significantly impaired by glucose depletion, yet medieval scholars, administrators, and architects were producing work of extraordinary complexity while beginning each day without food. This suggests either that medieval intellectual achievement was significantly constrained by nutritional policy, or that human cognitive adaptation to fasting is more flexible than contemporary research indicates. The artistic and cultural productions of medieval Europe, illuminated manuscripts, stone carving, metalwork, textile production, required precise hand-eye coordination and sustained attention to detail. These works were created by craftsmen who were culturally required to begin each day with empty stomachs and shaking hands from low blood sugar. Perhaps most significantly, the demographic expansion of medieval Europe occurred during the height of breakfast prohibition. Population growth, urban development, and agricultural expansion all took place within a civilization that had declared morning nutrition to be spiritually dangerous. How did medieval Europe manage to build the foundation of modern Western civilization while systematically undermining its own physical capacity through breakfast avoidance? The answer lies not in the efficiency of hunger, but in the tremendous human cost of medieval breakfast culture, a cost that was hidden by religious ideology but written into the bones, recorded in the shortened lifespans, and measured in the reduced productivity of an entire civilization that chose spiritual purity over basic human nutrition. What would medieval Europe have accomplished if its people had been properly fed from dawn until dusk? We can only imagine the cathedrals that were never built by workers too weak from hunger to lift the stones. In the pre-dawn darkness of medieval Europe, long before the first roosters announced the coming day, a quiet drama played out in thousands of households across the continent. It was the daily negotiation between survival and virtue, between the body's demands and the soul's supposed requirements. At the center of this drama stood bread, not merely food, but the very foundation upon which medieval life was built, the substance that could mean the difference between strength and collapse, between making it through another day and surrendering to the gnawing emptiness that had become civilization's chosen companion. Medievalists.net reveals the central paradox of medieval breakfast culture. Kings, knights, monks, peasants, everyone in the Middle Ages ate bread. Yet this most essential food was precisely what religious doctrine discouraged people from consuming in the morning hours. Bread wasn't just sustenance, it was the primary caloric source for up to 80% of most people's daily energy intake, making its absence in morning meals a form of systematic nutritional deprivation. The morning routine in a typical peasant household began with an assessment of resources that would seem impossibly grim by modern standards. Notes from the UK describes how brown bread was made for farm workers and the lowest servants, from a mix of barley, dried peas, malt, and some whole wheat or rye flour. This wasn't the soft, appealing bread we might imagine, but a dense, often gritty substance that required considerable jaw strength to consume and provided calories through sheer bulk rather than palatability. The social stratification of bread types created a hierarchy of morning possibilities that reflected the broader inequalities of medieval society. The flour of wheat explains how the well-to-do often enjoyed a fine white bread bun for breakfast, sometimes with currants or raisins in it, resembling a brioche. Peasants, on the other hand, consumed much coarser fare that barely qualified as bread by contemporary standards. But even among the peasantry, there were distinctions. Medievalists.net notes that In the Polish city of Wrocław, one could buy white bread, rye bread, black rye bread, wheat rolls, bagels, crescent rolls, or flat cakes. The variety suggests a complex urban bread economy where different types of morning sustenance were available depending on economic status and local agricultural conditions. The preparation of medieval bread reveals the enormous labor investment required for basic morning nutrition. Medievalists.net provides detailed instructions that show bread making as a multi-day process. Combine the flours in a mixing bowl, let stand overnight until foamy, knead for at least 20 minutes. Let the dough rise until doubled in bulk. For a medieval household to have fresh bread available in the morning meant that someone, typically women, had been working for days in advance. This labor intensity meant that bread availability fluctuated dramatically based on household resources and planning. Medievalists.net describes how poorer people would add rice, peas, lentils, chestnuts, acorns, or other foods into the mixture to extend their grain supplies, creating breads that were barely recognizable as such but provided crucial calories during periods of scarcity. The seasonal dimensions of bread availability created additional complexity for morning eating. Life in the Middle Ages emphasizes that the basis of the medieval diet for both peasants and aristocrats was bread, but grain supplies fluctuated dramatically based on harvest success and storage capabilities. During the months between harvests, particularly the dreaded spring period, bread became increasingly scarce and expensive. The religious use of bread added another layer of complication to morning consumption. Medievalists.net explains that bread is a key part of the Christian religion, and that the question of what kind of bread to use remained a deep theological dispute throughout the Middle Ages. The same substance that provided essential morning nutrition was also the body of Christ in the Eucharist, creating complex psychological associations between eating bread and spiritual consumption. Urban bread production created different challenges for morning sustenance. Medieval Britain describes how medieval bakers primarily made unleavened bread and were subject to strict regulations about weight, price, and quality. The assize of bread, established in 13th century England, set legal standards for bread production that prioritized consistency over affordability, potentially making morning bread less accessible to the poor. The economic implications of bread-based morning meals were substantial. Penn State Engineering reveals that each individual in houses of late medieval English nobility received standard daily food ration of 2 to 3 lbs of wheat bread and 1 gall of ale. This represents an enormous caloric intake, but it was distributed across the entire day, not concentrated in morning consumption. For peasant households, the mathematics of bread consumption were much more challenging. If each person needed 2-3 pounds of bread daily for adequate nutrition, a family of 5 would require 10-15 pounds of bread every day. During periods when fresh baking wasn't possible due to fuel shortages, grain scarcity, or time constraints, families had to make difficult decisions about when to consume their limited supplies. The storage and preservation of bread created additional morning complications. Medieval.eu describes how rye has traditionally been used to bake a heavy bread that does not raise as well as wheat bread. This denser bread could be stored longer, but became increasingly hard and difficult to eat, requiring soaking in liquid, usually ale or milk, to make it consumable. This soaking process created what became known as sops, bread soaked in liquid that represented one of the few forms of morning sustenance that wasn't technically considered a full meal. Tasting history describes sops as a compromise between religious fasting requirements and practical nutritional needs, allowing people to consume bread-based calories while maintaining the fiction that they weren't eating breakfast. The preparation of morning sops required liquid, typically ale, milk or wine, that might not be readily available in peasant households. C.C. Renaissance. Fair notes that peasants consumed small ale or small beer with their morning bread, but the brewing of this ale required additional grain resources and time that competed with bread production itself. The fuel requirements for bread production created particular challenges for morning consumption. Medievalists.net describes baking temperatures of 400 degrees Fahrenheit, 250 degrees Celsius for 15 minutes, then at 375 degrees for 10 to 20 minutes, requiring sustained high heat that consumed significant fuel resources. For households that had let their fires die overnight, the choice between warming leftover bread and conserving fuel for evening cooking became a daily calculation. Weather conditions dramatically affected bread availability and quality. During wet periods, grain became moldy or sprouted. During droughts, mills couldn't operate effectively. During extreme cold, the fermentation process slowed or stopped entirely. Medievalists.net mentions the danger of ergot-infected rye, which could cause ergotism, St. Anthony's fire, a condition that could be fatal but was often indistinguishable from normal hunger symptoms. The social rituals surrounding bread consumption reflected its central importance in medieval life. Medievalists.net describes how bread was used as trenchers, edible plates that were breads that were cut into thick, flat slices. Then other foods like meats or thick sauces would be served on top of them. This practice meant that bread served not just as food but as tableware, representing a level of abundance that most households couldn't achieve. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of medieval bread culture was how it transformed the simple act of morning eating into a complex negotiation between physical need, religious obligation, social status, and economic reality. Every piece of bread consumed in the morning carried the weight of theological implications, social expectations, and household resource management. How did medieval people navigate this complex landscape of bread-based nutrition while maintaining their spiritual and social standing? What strategies did they develop to reconcile their body's demands with their soul's supposed requirements? Every medieval dawn brought with it a series of calculations that would seem incomprehensible to modern minds. In households across Europe, people woke to confront not just the simple question of what to eat, but a complex matrix of religious obligation, economic constraint, social expectation, and physical necessity that transformed the basic act of consuming bread into a form of daily moral mathematics. The physical realities of medieval bread storage created the first set of morning dilemmas. Medievalists.net describes bread as becoming increasingly hard and difficult to eat over time, requiring soaking in liquid, usually ale or milk, to make it consumable. For a peasant family waking to find yesterday's bread hardened to near stone consistency, the choice between using precious liquid to soften it or saving that liquid for other needs became a daily crisis of resource allocation. The seasonal availability of grain created deeper structural problems that affected every morning meal. The food historian identifies March and April as the most dangerous time of year for eaters in northerly climes, when grain stores from the previous harvest were running low and new crops weren't yet available. During these months, families faced what historians call the starving time, weeks when every morsel of bread had to be carefully rationed. British food history describes how during famine conditions, people were essentially reduced to a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, trapping wild animals and foraging for pig nuts, berries, and other wild foods. But even these desperate measures required energy that morning bread might have provided, creating a vicious cycle where the lack of morning nutrition made it harder to obtain emergency food sources. The milling and processing of grain added another layer of complexity to bread availability. Witheridge Historical Archive explains that grain processing occurred in September, involving harvesting, tying, winnowing, fruit picking, and milling. This meant that fresh flour, and therefore fresh bread, was primarily available in late summer and early fall, with bread quality declining throughout the winter and spring months. Urban bread production operated according to different principles that created new forms of morning inequality. Medieval Britain describes how medieval bakers were subject to strict regulations about weight, price, and quality through the assize of bread. These regulations protected consumers from fraud, but also made bread more expensive and less accessible to the poor, who might have preferred to bake their own bread if they had access to grain and fuel. The social dynamics of bread sharing revealed the complex negotiations that surrounded morning eating. Medievalists.net notes that after meals, trencher bread could be given to the poor or animals if the household was wealthy or generous enough. This practice created a hierarchy of bread consumption where the poor might receive morning sustenance only as leftover scraps from the previous evening's meals of the wealthy. The relationship between bread quality and social status created additional morning complications. Notes from the UK describes a clear hierarchy: white bread for the wealthy, brown bread for farm workers and servants, and the poorest quality bread for the destitute. But this hierarchy operated differently in the morning, when religious restrictions meant that even wealthy people might be consuming lower quality bread or none at all. Regional variations in grain types created different challenges for morning bread consumption. Medievalists.net explains that in medieval France, most people would eat a type of bread known as meslin, which was made from a mixture of wheat and rye. This mixed grain bread represented a compromise between nutrition and availability, but it also required different preparation techniques and had different storage characteristics than pure wheat or rye breads. The fuel economics of bread preparation created daily dilemmas that affected entire households. Medievalists.net describes baking processes that required sustained, high temperatures, meaning that bread preparation competed directly with other household needs for fuel. During cold weather, families faced the choice between using wood for heating, cooking the main meals, or maintaining the fires necessary for bread production. The preservation techniques available for bread were limited and labor-intensive. Medieval food preservation describes how dry salting, where the meat or fish was buried in salt, and brine curing, where meat was soaked in salty water, were used for proteins. But bread had to be consumed relatively quickly, or it would become moldy or inedibly hard. This meant that bread production had to be carefully timed to household consumption patterns. The religious calendar added another layer of complexity to bread consumption patterns. Fatima.org explains that during Lent, Christians were restricted to eating bread, vegetables, and some salt, with meat prohibited entirely. During these periods, bread became even more crucial for morning sustenance, yet the religious prohibition against morning eating remained in effect. The brewing of small ale required grain that could otherwise be used for bread, creating competition between liquid and solid forms of morning nutrition. Brachiotrix describes the brewing process as requiring home malted and dehydrated rye and naked oat grains, representing a significant investment of agricultural resources that might otherwise have produced bread. Market dynamics affected bread availability in ways that particularly impacted morning consumption. The Medieverse notes that in the average household of medieval cities, it was the wife's job to go to the market almost every morning to get ingredients for the meals her family would have that day. This daily marketing meant that fresh ingredients were available each morning, but it also meant that bread had to be purchased or prepared from these daily acquisitions rather than from stored supplies. The economic calculations involved in bread production were staggering for peasant households. Penn State Engineering reveals that noble households provided 2-3 lbs of wheat bread per person daily, but peasant families had to produce this quantity themselves using whatever grain they could afford or grow. For a family of 5, this meant producing 10 to 15 pounds of bread daily, a massive undertaking that required significant grain, fuel, and labor resources. The storage of grain and flour created additional challenges for consistent bread production. Lives of the Past describes medieval preservation techniques, but grain storage was particularly problematic due to moisture, vermin, and spoilage. Families had to balance between grinding grain fresh for each batch of bread, which required access to mills and additional labor, or storing flour, which spoiled more quickly than whole grain. The timing of bread production created conflicts with other household responsibilities. Medievalists.net describes bread making as requiring overnight fermentation, extended kneading, rising time, and careful baking, a process that could take days from start to finish. For households where women were responsible for multiple forms of food production, childcare, and other domestic tasks, bread making had to be carefully coordinated with other responsibilities. The legal regulations surrounding bread production affected morning availability in unexpected ways. Medieval Britain explains that the assize of bread controlled not just prices, but also the timing and location of bread sales. These regulations could limit when and where bread was available for purchase, potentially making morning bread acquisition more difficult for urban households. The health implications of irregular bread consumption were significant but poorly understood. Medievalists.net mentions that physicians recommended white wheat bread as healthy, but the irregular eating patterns imposed by religious restrictions meant that even healthy bread was consumed in ways that modern nutrition science would recognize as metabolically damaging. The psychological impact of bread scarcity on morning routines must have been profound. When the most basic food, bread, was uncertain from day to day, every morning began with an assessment of household resources that could determine whether the family would have adequate nutrition for the day's work. This uncertainty would have created chronic stress that affected not just physical health, but mental well-being. The seasonal cycles of bread production meant that morning bread availability fluctuated dramatically throughout the year. Witheridge Historical Archive describes harvest and processing cycles that concentrated grain availability in late summer and fall, meaning that winter and spring mornings were increasingly likely to begin without adequate bread supplies. But perhaps most significantly, the complex calculations surrounding morning bread consumption reveal how medieval society had transformed the most basic human need, food, into an elaborate system of moral, economic, and social constraints that made simple nutrition into a daily ordeal of resource management and spiritual negotiation. How did medieval families develop strategies to navigate these impossible choices? What innovations and adaptations allowed them to survive in a system that seemed designed to make morning sustenance as difficult and morally complicated as possible? In the final analysis, medieval bread culture reveals something profound about human adaptability. When a civilization decides that its most essential food should be morally complicated, people don't simply starve, they develop elaborate systems of survival that transform necessity into ritual, desperation into devotion, and hunger into a form of spiritual practice that somehow sustains both body and soul. The archaeological evidence of medieval bread consumption tells a story that contradicts the religious narratives of the time. 4 fun facts about medieval bread reveals that grains in the form of ale, gruel or porridge, and bread comprised between 65 and 80% of a medieval person's daily caloric intake. This massive dependence on grain-based nutrition meant that, despite religious prohibitions against morning eating, people had to find ways to consume adequate carbohydrates or face complete physical collapse. The solution came through what can only be described as nutritional subterfuge, elaborate systems that allowed people to consume essential calories while maintaining the religious fiction that they weren't eating breakfast. Goat cookery provides specific examples. In 1289, peasants working as carters on Ferring Manor in Sussex had a breakfast of rye bread with ale and cheese. In 1512, clerks and yeomen in the Northumberland household received morning provisions that included bread, ale, and protein. These documented examples reveal that by the later medieval period, practical necessity had begun to override religious ideology, but the transition wasn't straightforward. The same source notes that these morning meals were provided to workers, people whose physical labor made morning nutrition an economic necessity rather than a spiritual luxury. The Church could maintain its theological position against breakfast, while allowing practical exceptions for those whose productivity was essential to the broader economy. The development of ESOPs represented perhaps the most ingenious solution to the breakfast prohibition. Tasting history describes sops as bread soaked in wine, ale, or milk, technically not a solid meal, but rather a liquid refreshment that happened to contain substantial calories. This allowed medieval people to consume what was essentially porridge, while maintaining that they were drinking rather than eating. The preparation of sops required specific techniques that reveal the sophistication of medieval nutritional adaptation. Tasting history provides a 15th century recipe that involves soaking bread in sweetened wine with spices, creating what was essentially medieval cinnamon toast crunch, a morning meal that provided carbohydrates, calories, and flavor, while remaining technically acceptable under religious restrictions. But the most profound adaptation was how medieval people learned to ritualize their bread consumption in ways that made eating into a form of prayer. Medievalists.net describes how bread is a key part of the Christian religion, and how the Eucharist transformed bread consumption into spiritual communion. Medieval people learned to approach their morning bread not as simple nutrition but as a form of religious practice that connected physical sustenance with spiritual nourishment. This sacralization of bread consumption created new forms of mourning, ritual that combined practical nutrition with religious observance. Families would begin their day not just by eating bread but by blessing it, sharing it according to religious principles, and consuming it with prayers of gratitude that acknowledged both its physical necessity and its spiritual significance. The seasonal rhythms of bread production became integrated with the religious calendar in ways that created predictable patterns of abundance and scarcity. Medievalists.net explains that harvest festivals coincided with periods of maximum bread availability, while Lenten fasting occurred during the spring months when grain stores were naturally low. This alignment between agricultural reality and religious practice created a system where deprivation became spiritually meaningful rather than simply economically determined. The social dimensions of bread sharing developed elaborate protocols that reflected both Christian charity and practical resource management. Medievalists.net describes how leftover trencher bread was given to the poor or animals, but this practice evolved into systematic charity networks where morning bread distribution became a form of religious obligation for wealthy households. These charitable bread distributions created parallel morning economies where the poor could access nutrition through religious networks even when they couldn't afford market prices. Monasteries, manor houses, and urban guilds developed formal systems for morning bread distribution that provided essential calories to the destitute while allowing donors to fulfill religious obligations about feeding the hungry. The technological innovations in bread production reflected medieval attempts to maximize nutritional value while minimizing resource consumption. Medievalists.net describes various techniques for extending grain supplies, adding rice, peas, lentils, chestnuts, acorns or other foods into the mixture to create breads that provided more diverse nutrition from limited grain resources. These fortified breads represented sophisticated understanding of nutritional needs that went far beyond simple carbohydrate provision. By incorporating legumes, nuts, and other protein sources into bread recipes, medieval bakers created morning foods that provided more complete nutrition than pure grain breads, helping to sustain workers through long days of physical labor. The preservation techniques for bread revealed another form of medieval innovation. Medieval.tu describes how rye has traditionally been used to bake a heavy bread that kept longer than wheat bread, providing households with more reliable access to morning nutrition over extended periods. Dense rye breads could be stored for days or weeks, then reconstituted with liquids to create morning sops when fresh bread wasn't available. The economic networks that supported bread production created complex interdependencies that made morning nutrition a community rather than individual responsibility. Medieval Britain describes how medieval bakers operated within regulated systems that guaranteed bread availability at controlled prices, creating social safety nets that ensured basic nutrition even during difficult periods. These regulatory systems represented early forms of food security policy that recognized bread as too essential to be left entirely to market forces. The assize of bread didn't just control prices, it mandated that bread be available to all social classes, creating legal guarantees for morning nutrition that superseded both religious restrictions and economic constraints. The guild systems that governed bread production created apprenticeship networks that preserved and transmitted sophisticated knowledge about grain processing, fermentation, and baking techniques. Medieval Britain explains how this knowledge was carefully controlled and regulated, ensuring that bread production remained reliable even as individual bakers died or moved. The international trade networks that supplied grain for urban bread production created early forms of global food security. Medievalists.net describes how different regions specialized in different types of grain production, with trade networks that could compensate for local crop failures by importing grain from distant areas. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of medieval bread culture was how it created forms of social solidarity that transcended class boundaries. Rich and poor, urban and rural, clergy and laity all depended on bread for survival, and all participated in the complex systems of production, distribution, and consumption that made morning nutrition possible despite religious and economic constraints. The legacy of medieval bread culture extends far beyond historical curiosity. The systems of regulation, charity, and community cooperation that developed around bread production created models for food security that influenced European society for centuries. The idea that basic nutrition is too important to be left entirely to individual resources, that communities have obligations to ensure that all members have access to essential foods, emerged directly from medieval experiences with bread scarcity and distribution. Modern food banks, agricultural subsidies, and nutritional assistance programs all trace their conceptual origins to medieval bread distribution systems that recognized food as both a private commodity and a public necessity. The morning bread that medieval people struggled to obtain within the constraints of religious prohibition created institutional innovations that continue to shape how societies approach food security today. The transformation of bread from simple food into spiritual practice, economic commodity, and social bond reveals the extraordinary human capacity to find meaning and community even within systems of systematic deprivation. Medieval people didn't just survive their civilization's decision to make breakfast morally complicated, they created new forms of culture, spirituality, and social organization that turned their shared hunger into shared humanity. In the end, medieval bread culture teaches us that when basic needs become culturally problematic, people don't simply abandon those needs. They develop elaborate systems that allow them to meet their requirements while honoring their values, creating forms of community resilience that can sustain entire civilizations through centuries of self-imposed nutritional hardship. In the pre-dawn silence of medieval Europe, while religious doctrine commanded empty stomachs and cold hearths discouraged elaborate meal preparation, there was one form of morning sustenance that managed to navigate the treacherous waters between necessity and sin, between survival and spirituality. It came in the form of a humble, often cloudy liquid that modern people would barely recognize as related to contemporary beverages, small ale, weak beer, and various fermented drinks that provided the liquid foundation upon which medieval civilization literally floated. Small beer. Wikipedia reveals the crucial role this beverage played in daily life. Sometimes unfiltered and porridge-like, it was a favored drink in medieval Europe and colonial North America, compared with more expensive beer, containing higher alcohol content. But calling it simply a drink understates its fundamental importance. Small beer was liquid bread, liquid nutrition, and liquid safety all combined into a single substance that medieval people consumed from dawn until dusk, including those theoretically forbidden morning hours. The morning consumption of small ale represented one of the most successful adaptations to medieval breakfast restrictions. CC Renaissance. Fair explains that, instead of having coffee or tea like we enjoy today, a beverage of small ale, or small beer, was served. This staple beer-like drink had minimal alcohol content and was believed to be more nourishing and safer than water, which was often contaminated. Even children drank it. The image of medieval children beginning their days with alcohol, even weak alcohol, seems shocking to modern sensibilities, but it reflects a fundamental truth about medieval life. Water wasn't safe to drink. The original small beer explains that small beer was consumed for its hydrating and nutritional properties in households, workplaces, and even schools, making it the primary liquid consumed by people of all ages throughout the day. The production of small beer reveals the sophisticated understanding of fermentation and nutrition that medieval brewers possessed. Brassaiotrix provides detailed brewing instructions that show small ale production as requiring home-malted and dehydrated rye and naked oat grains, then allowing the mixture to cool overnight as per the instructions and added my yeast in the morning. This timing meant that fresh small beer was available each morning, providing a socially acceptable way to consume grain-based calories. Ancestral Kitchen describes the brewing process in more detail. I make a wort with the dry, malt and ferment with a robust homemade yeast culture. The creation of small beer required sophisticated knowledge of fermentation, timing, and ingredient ratios that produced a beverage with enough alcohol to be safe from contamination, but not enough to cause intoxication during morning consumption. The nutritional content of small beer was substantial. Crescent City Brew Talk explains that medieval households would produce both a strong ale with OG around 1.075 and a small beer with OG in the mid to upper 1.030s, meaning that even the weaker version contained significant calories from grain sugars. A pint of small beer could provide as many calories as a slice of bread, but in liquid form that didn't technically violate religious restrictions against morning eating. The social stratification of morning beverages reflected broader medieval inequalities. Tudor Times notes that small ale was weak and very bitter, appropriate for breakfast and daily consumption by workers, while stronger ales were reserved for evening meals and higher social classes. The quality and strength of morning ale became a marker of social status, with the poor consuming weak, bitter drinks while the wealthy enjoyed stronger, more palatable beverages. But even among the poor, small beer represented a remarkable investment of household resources. The grain required for brewing competed directly with grain needed for bread production, meaning that families had to allocate their limited agricultural output between solid and liquid forms of nutrition. Ian Visits emphasizes that people didn't drink small beer to stay healthy, they drank small beer to give them energy, highlighting the crucial role these beverages played in providing morning calories for physical labor. The brewing knowledge required for small beer production was extensive and carefully guarded. Crescent City Brew Talk describes how medieval ales would have been spiced by the medieval brewers, using herbs and spices not just for flavor, but for preservation and nutritional enhancement. This spicing knowledge represented sophisticated understanding of how different plants could improve the safety, shelf life, and nutritional value of fermented beverages. The timing of small beer consumption created its own daily rhythms that shaped medieval morning routines. Fresh small beer was typically available each morning after overnight fermentation, but it had to be consumed relatively quickly before spoilage occurred. This meant that households developed brewing cycles that coordinated small beer production with daily consumption patterns, creating predictable rhythms of morning liquid nutrition. The regional variations in small beer production reflected local agricultural conditions and cultural preferences. Medieval English brewing notes that different areas specialized in different grain types for brewing, with some regions using primarily barley, others incorporating oats, rye, or wheat, depending on local crop success and soil conditions. The economic implications of small beer production were substantial for household budgets. Families had to maintain brewing equipment, acquire yeast cultures, allocate grain for brewing rather than direct consumption, and invest labor in the brewing process. For peasant households operating at subsistence levels, these investments represented significant economic decisions that affected overall family nutrition and survival. The religious acceptance of small beer consumption in the morning created one of the few sanctioned forms of morning nutrition available to medieval people. Unlike solid food, which clearly violated breakfast prohibitions, liquid consumption occupied a gray area in religious doctrine that allowed people to obtain essential calories without obvious spiritual transgression. The preservation aspects of small beer production reveal another dimension of its importance. Medieval food. Preservation describes various techniques for food preservation, but fermentation represented one of the most reliable methods for creating safe, long-lasting nutrition from grain resources. Small beer could be stored for days or weeks under proper conditions, providing households with more reliable access to liquid nutrition than fresh water or milk. The medicinal properties attributed to small beer made it even more valuable for morning consumption. Medieval medicine recognized fermented beverages as healthier than water, not just because they were safer from contamination, but because they were believed to provide better nutritional support for people engaged in physical labor. The small amount of alcohol was considered beneficial for digestion and energy, making small beer a form of liquid medicine as well as nutrition. The seasonal production cycles of small beer created predictable patterns of abundance and scarcity that affected morning nutrition throughout the year. Fresh grain for brewing was most available after harvest, meaning that autumn and early winter were periods of optimal small beer production, while spring represented the most challenging time for maintaining adequate brewing supplies. The social aspects of small beer consumption created community bonds that extended beyond individual household nutrition. Brewing knowledge was shared among neighbors, yeast cultures were traded or gifted, and the quality of different households' small beer became a matter of local reputation and social standing. But perhaps most significantly, small beer consumption reveals how medieval people found ways to meet their nutritional needs while working within the constraints of religious and social prohibition. The transformation of grain into liquid allowed morning caloric consumption that would have been forbidden in solid form, demonstrating the remarkable human capacity for adaptation when survival depends on finding loopholes in ideological systems. How did medieval households develop the sophisticated brewing knowledge necessary for reliable small beer production? What innovations and techniques allowed them to create safe, nutritious morning beverages from the same grains that were often unavailable for bread? The morning mist that rose from medieval brewing vats carried more than just the aroma of fermenting grain. It carried the hopes of entire households for another day of adequate nutrition within a system that had made such nutrition morally suspect. The production of small beer wasn't simply a matter of following recipes. It was a complex dance of timing, temperature, ingredient availability, and brewing knowledge that could mean the difference between morning energy and morning collapse. Brachiatrix provides intimate detail about the medieval brewing process. After the brewing process, I let the wort cool overnight, as per the instructions, and added my yeast in the morning. This timing reveals the sophisticated understanding medieval brewers had of fermentation cycles. The cooling had to occur at precisely the right rate to create conditions for healthy yeast activity, and the morning yeast addition had to happen at exactly the right temperature to ensure proper fermentation. The yeast cultures that made small beer possible represented one of the most valuable possessions in medieval households. Ancestral Kitchen describes using a robust homemade yeast culture for brewing, but creating and maintaining these cultures required extensive knowledge and careful attention. Yeast had to be kept alive through feeding, proper temperature control, and protection from contamination, a process that made successful brewing as much about microbiology as agriculture. The ingredient ratios for small beer production required precise calculations that balanced nutrition, flavor, safety, and resource conservation. Crescent City Brew Talk explains that medieval brewers would create a strong ale with OG around 1.075 and a small beer with OG in the mid to upper 1.030s. But achieving these specific gravities required careful measurement of grain to water, ratios that many medieval households had learned through generations of trial and error. The malting process that preceded brewing demanded its own specialized knowledge and equipment. Ancestral Kitchen describes using home-malted and dehydrated rye and naked oat grains, but malting required controlled sprouting of grain under specific temperature and moisture conditions, followed by careful drying to halt germination at precisely the right point to maximize fermentable sugars. Seasonal variations in brewing created challenges that tested medieval brewing knowledge throughout the year. Winter brewing required maintaining fermentation temperatures in cold conditions, while summer brewing risked spoilage from excessive heat. Brachiatrix notes the importance of overnight cooling, but achieving proper cooling rates required understanding of how different weather conditions affected fermentation timing. The water quality issues that made small beer necessary also complicated its production. Reddit history discusses how medieval people chose ale over water because water often carried illness, but brewers still needed water for production. This meant finding sources clean enough for brewing while avoiding the contaminated water that made fermented beverages necessary for drinking. The spicing and flavoring of small beer represented sophisticated understanding of both preservation and nutrition. Crescent City Brew Talk notes that medieval ales would have been spiced, but the choice of spices wasn't arbitrary. Different herbs and spices provided antiseptic properties that helped prevent spoilage, nutritional supplements that enhanced the beer's health benefits, and flavoring that made weak, often bitter, small beer more palatable for daily consumption. The equipment required for small beer production demanded significant household investment and maintenance. brewing required vessels for malting, mashing, boiling, fermenting, and storage, each requiring specific materials and construction techniques to avoid contamination and ensure proper temperature control. For peasant households, acquiring and maintaining this equipment represented substantial economic commitments. The fuel requirements for brewing created competition with other household needs for wood and coal. Ancestral Kitchen describes the need to make a wort, which required sustained boiling of grain mixtures, consuming fuel that might otherwise be used for heating, cooking main meals, or bread baking. Households had to balance brewing needs against other fuel requirements throughout the year. The storage and preservation of small beer required additional knowledge and equipment. Unlike modern beer, medieval small beer had limited shelf life and required specific storage conditions to prevent spoilage or over-fermentation. Tudor times describe small ale as weak and very bitter, partly because proper storage techniques were difficult to maintain in medieval conditions. The quality control aspects of small beer production were crucial for food safety. Bad batches could cause illness or fail to provide adequate nutrition, while over-fermented beer could become too alcoholic for morning consumption or too sour for palatability. Medieval brewers had to develop testing methods and quality indicators that ensured their products were safe and nutritious without modern analytical tools. The economic calculations involved in small beer production were complex and varied seasonally. Grain allocated to brewing couldn't be used for bread or sold for cash. Yeast cultures required ongoing maintenance and feeding. Fuel had to be reserved for brewing processes, and labor had to be allocated to brewing activities. Ian Visits emphasizes that small beer was consumed to give them energy, making it an essential investment despite its costs. The social networks that supported brewing knowledge were extensive and carefully maintained. Successful brewing techniques were shared among neighbors, yeast cultures were traded or gifted between households, and brewing failures were community problems that required mutual assistance. The knowledge required for consistent small beer production was too complex for individual households to develop independently. The legal and regulatory aspects of brewing created additional complications for household beer production. Medieval Britain describes regulations similar to those governing bread production, with authorities controlling the quality, strength and sale of fermented beverages to ensure public safety and fair pricing. The nutritional optimization of small beer production required understanding of how different grains contributed different nutrients to the final product. Brassiotrix mentions using rye and naked oat grains, but medieval brewers knew that different grain combinations produced beverages with different nutritional profiles, protein content, and caloric density. The timing coordination between brewing cycles and household consumption required sophisticated planning. Fresh, small beer was most nutritious and safest immediately after fermentation, but brewing cycles had to be coordinated with grain availability, household labor schedules, and fuel resources. Families had to plan brewing activities days or weeks in advance to ensure consistent morning nutrition. The medicinal aspects of small beer production added another layer of complexity to brewing knowledge. Medieval medicine recognized different herbs and spices as having specific health benefits, meaning that brewing decisions involved not just nutritional and economic considerations, but also medical judgments about household health needs. The cultural significance of brewing knowledge made successful small beer production a source of household pride and social status. The quality of a family's small beer reflected their brewing skill, resource management, and cultural sophistication, creating social pressures that went beyond simple nutrition and survival. But perhaps most remarkably, the complexity of small beer production reveals how medieval households developed sophisticated technological and scientific knowledge in response to the intersection of religious prohibition, public health necessity, and economic constraint. The daily production of safe, nutritious morning beverages required mastery of fermentation science, resource management, quality control, and seasonal planning that rivals modern brewing knowledge in its complexity and sophistication. How did medieval communities develop and preserve this complex brewing knowledge across generations? What happened when brewing knowledge was lost or when household brewing capacity failed during critical periods? As the medieval world slowly moved toward morning, as the weak sun struggled through smoke and mist to illuminate another day of systematic deprivation disguised as spiritual virtue, the empty cups and brewing vessels scattered across Europe told a story of adaptation that was simultaneously ingenious and tragic. Small beer had become the liquid lifeline that kept medieval civilization functioning, but it had also become something else, a daily reminder of how far human society could distance itself from basic biological needs while still managing to survive. The long-term health effects of small beer consumption reveal the hidden costs of medieval morning nutrition. Quora. Medieval beer explains that medieval beer came in a variety of strengths, from small beer often made weekly and used in place of water. Water often carried illness, but the continuous consumption of even weak alcohol from childhood created metabolic and physiological adaptations that modern medicine is only beginning to understand. The archaeological evidence of medieval brewing reveals the massive scale of small beer production. Every household, monastery, manor, and urban dwelling required brewing capacity sufficient to provide liquid nutrition for all inhabitants throughout the year. The sheer volume of grain diverted from direct food consumption to brewing represents one of the largest resource allocation decisions in medieval society, a civilization choosing to transform a significant portion of its agricultural output into liquid form. Reddit. History poses the crucial question: when did beer, ale, stop being acceptable at breakfast? The answer reveals how deeply embedded small beer consumption was in medieval morning routines. The practice didn't disappear suddenly but gradually faded as water safety improved, coffee and tea became available, and religious attitudes toward breakfast evolved. The economic implications of small beer dependency were staggering for medieval households. Ian Visits notes that people consumed small beer for energy rather than hydration, meaning that substantial portions of household agricultural output were devoted to producing liquid calories rather than more efficient solid foods. This represented a massive economic inefficiency driven by public health necessity and religious restriction. The social stratification revealed through small beer consumption patterns exposes the deep inequalities that characterized medieval breakfast culture. Tudor Times describes how small ale was weak and very bitter, appropriate for breakfast consumption by laborers, while stronger, more palatable beverages remained available to wealthy households. Even liquid nutrition became a marker of social class. The seasonal cycles of small beer production created predictable patterns of abundance and scarcity that affected entire communities. Ancestral Kitchen describes brewing with home-malted and dehydrated rye and naked oat grains, but these ingredients were only available at specific times of year. Spring months, when grain stores were lowest, coincided with periods when brewing capacity was most limited. The dependency on small beer for morning nutrition created vulnerabilities that could affect entire regions during agricultural crises. When grain harvests failed, communities faced the choice between eating their grain directly or brewing it for liquid consumption. British food history describes famine conditions where people were essentially reduced to a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, but brewing capacity often failed before direct food consumption, leaving communities without their primary source of morning liquid nutrition. The technological innovations in brewing that emerged from constant small beer production created one of medieval Europe's most sophisticated industrial processes. Crescent City Brew Talk describes medieval brewing as requiring precise control of OG around 1.075 and a small beer with OG in the mid to upper whilst 130s, demanding measurement and quality control techniques that rivaled other medieval crafts in their complexity. The knowledge preservation systems that maintained brewing expertise across generations reveal how communities protected essential survival information. Brasseatrix describes brewing techniques that required homemade yeast culture, maintenance, and precise timing, representing technical knowledge that had to be carefully transmitted from experienced brewers to apprentices to ensure community survival. The environmental impact of medieval brewing was substantial and often overlooked. The fuel requirements for constant small beer production consumed significant forest resources, while the grain allocation to brewing affected agricultural land use patterns. Communities had to balance brewing needs against other environmental pressures in ways that shaped medieval landscape management. The psychological effects of depending on small beer for morning nutrition created complex relationships between medieval people and their daily liquid consumption. Unlike modern recreational drinking, small beer consumption was a survival necessity that began in childhood and continued throughout life. This created cultural attitudes toward fermented beverages that were fundamentally different from contemporary alcohol consumption patterns. The religious implications of small beer consumption revealed the complex theological negotiations that allowed medieval communities to reconcile survival needs with spiritual requirements. Quora, did they really drink alcohol? Explains that medieval people consumed small beer, around 2% alcohol, small or watered-down wine, around 3 to 4% alcohol, in the morning, but this consumption had to be justified within religious frameworks that discouraged morning indulgence. The medicinal aspects of small beer consumption created parallel systems of healthcare that operated through daily brewing decisions. Medieval medicine recognized fermented beverages as having specific health benefits, meaning that brewing choices involved medical as well as nutritional considerations. Households adjusted their brewing techniques based on seasonal illness patterns, individual health needs, and available medicinal herbs. The urban versus rural differences in small beer production and consumption reveal how brewing adapted to different economic and social conditions. Urban households often purchase small beer from commercial brewers, while rural families typically produce their own, creating different relationships with brewing knowledge and different vulnerabilities to supply disruptions. The trade networks that supported brewing ingredients created some of medieval Europe's most extensive commercial relationships. Original small beer describes small beer as having hydrating and nutritional properties that made it essential for households, workplaces, and even schools, requiring supply chains that could deliver brewing materials to communities throughout Europe. The legal frameworks that governed small beer production reveal how seriously medieval authorities took liquid nutrition security. Regulations controlled not just the strength and quality of small beer, but also its availability and pricing, recognizing that interruptions in small beer supply could cause public health crises. The gender roles in small beer production created specialized knowledge systems where women often controlled brewing techniques while men controlled grain allocation and marketing. This division of brewing labor created complex household dynamics where morning nutrition depended on coordination between different types of expertise. The childhood experiences of medieval people who grew up consuming small beer from infancy created cultural patterns that shaped entire civilizations. CC Renaissance. Fair notes that even children drank it, meaning that entire generations developed within cultures where morning alcohol consumption was normal and necessary rather than recreational. The decline of small beer consumption paralleled broader changes in European society that included improved water safety, expanded trade networks that brought coffee and tea, and evolving religious attitudes toward morning eating. But this transition represented the end of one of medieval Europe's most successful adaptations to the intersection of public health necessity and religious restriction. The archaeological legacy of medieval brewing reveals the massive infrastructure that supported small beer production. Every excavated medieval site contains evidence of brewing equipment, grain storage, and fermentation facilities, demonstrating how central liquid nutrition was to daily life. The scale of this infrastructure suggests that small beer production was one of medieval Europe's largest industries. The cultural memory of small beer consumption persisted long after the practice declined, influencing European attitudes toward breakfast beverages, fermented foods, and morning nutrition that can still be traced in contemporary food cultures. The morning consumption of liquid calories, whether coffee, tea, or modern breakfast drinks, maintains patterns established during centuries of small beer dependency. The environmental adaptations that small beer production required created brewing techniques suited to different climates, water sources, and seasonal patterns throughout Europe. These regional brewing traditions preserved local ecological knowledge while creating cultural identities that persisted long after small beer consumption ended. The economic calculations that justified small beer production reveal how medieval communities developed sophisticated cost-benefit analyses that balanced immediate nutrition needs against long-term resource management. The decision to allocate grain to brewing rather than direct consumption required understanding of caloric efficiency, storage limitations, and seasonal variation that demonstrated remarkable economic sophistication. The social bonds created through shared brewing knowledge and small beer consumption created community networks that supported medieval society through crises and challenges. The daily morning consumption of locally produced beverages created forms of social solidarity that connected individual household survival with community resilience. But perhaps most significantly, the story of small beer reveals how human societies can develop remarkable technological and cultural sophistication in response to constraints that seem designed to make basic survival more difficult. Medieval Europe's transformation of morning nutrition into a complex industrial process of fermentation, preservation, and distribution created systems of community cooperation and technical innovation that sustained millions of people through centuries of systematic breakfast deprivation. The bitter dregs at the bottom of medieval brewing vessels contained more than just the residue of fermentation. They contained the evidence of human adaptability, community resilience, and the extraordinary lengths to which people will go to meet basic needs while honoring the cultural and religious values that define their civilizations. In the end, small beer succeeded not because it was an ideal solution to morning nutrition, but because it was a workable compromise between survival and ideology that allowed medieval communities to maintain both their physical health and their spiritual identity within a system that seemed designed to make both impossible. Long before T.S. Eliot declared April the cruelest month, medieval Europeans had learned through centuries of bitter experience that spring represented not renewal and hope, but the most dangerous period in the annual cycle of survival. While modern minds associate spring with abundance, fresh growth, warmer weather, and agricultural optimism, medieval reality was starkly different. Spring was when last year's harvest stores reached their lowest point, when winter's preserved foods spoiled or ran out entirely, and when the new year's crops remained months away from harvest. Spring was the season when medieval breakfast culture revealed its most brutal consequences. The food historian identifies March and April as the most dangerous time of year for eaters in northerly climes, explaining that a poor harvest or improper storage during the previous year created conditions where spring became a period of systematic starvation. This wasn't accidental or occasional. It was the predictable result of agricultural cycles that concentrated food availability in autumn and winter while creating systematic scarcity during spring and early summer. The mathematical brutality of medieval food storage reveals why spring was so dangerous. Witheridge Historical Archive explains that grain harvest occurred in August, with processing and storage happening in September. This meant that by March, 6 months after harvest, stores that had to last until the next August were approaching depletion. For households that had experienced poor harvests, inadequate storage, or unexpected demands on their food supplies, spring represented the moment when careful rationing gave way to desperate shortage. British food history describes how during spring food crises, people were essentially reduced to a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, trapping wild animals and foraging for pig nuts, berries, and other wild foods. But this foraging had to be conducted by people who were already weakened by months of declining nutrition, creating a vicious cycle where the energy required to find emergency food sources was precisely what systematic undernutrition had depleted. The seasonal pattern of medieval hunger wasn't random. It was the direct result of agricultural and storage technologies that couldn't adequately bridge the gap between harvests. Agriculture in the Middle Ages. Wikipedia describes medieval farming as dependent on seasonal cycles, where weather playing a huge role in crop success. Good harvests meant stability, while poor ones led to hardship. But even good harvests couldn't eliminate spring hunger because preservation and storage technologies weren't adequate for year-round food security. The religious calendar's intersection with seasonal hunger created additional complications for spring survival. Fatima.org explains that Lenten fasting required medieval Christians to subsist on bread, vegetables, and some salt during Lent. Fish was permitted, though uncommon, but these restrictions coincided precisely with the period when household food stores were most depleted. The Church's requirement for increased fasting during spring compounded the natural scarcity that made this season most dangerous. The demographic impact of spring hunger was severe and well documented. Europe now describes medieval famines as including poor weather, failed harvests, and subsequent disruption, including high prices and deaths. But many of these deaths occurred during spring months when accumulated malnutrition combined with increased physical demands from agricultural work and depleted immune systems from winter illnesses. Great Famine. Wikipedia provides a specific example. The Great Famine started with bad weather in spring 1315. Crop failures lasted through 1316 until the summer harvest in 1317, and Europe did not fully recover for several more years. This demonstrates how spring weather problems could trigger multi-year cycles of food insecurity that affected entire regions. The agricultural labor demands of spring created a particularly cruel paradox. Medieval agricultural year explains that spring required intensive field preparation, planting, and early crop maintenance that demanded significant physical energy precisely when people's nutritional reserves were lowest. Workers had to perform the most critical agricultural tasks of the year while operating on depleted energy stores and minimal morning nutrition. The preservation failures that characterized spring food crisis reveal the technological limitations that made seasonal starvation inevitable. Medieval food. Preservation describes preservation techniques including dry salting, where the meat or fish was buried in salt, and brine curing, where meat was soaked in salty water. But these methods had limited effectiveness. Even successfully preserved foods deteriorated over winter months, becoming less nutritious and less palatable by spring. Storage pests and spoilage added to spring food shortages in ways that made careful autumn preparation meaningless. Lives of the Past describes medieval preservation challenges, but stored grain was vulnerable to rodents, insects, moisture, and fungal contamination that could destroy months of food reserves. Families could follow all preservation guidelines and still face spring starvation due to storage failures beyond their control. The economic pressures that intensified during spring created additional challenges for food access. Europe Now notes that food crises included high prices as well as shortages, meaning that even when food was available, spring price increases put it beyond the reach of many families. The intersection of increased demand, reduced supply, and depleted household economic resources made spring food access particularly difficult. Regional variations in spring hunger patterns reflected different agricultural systems and preservation capacities. Famines in medieval Europe describes how famines in Europe during the medieval and early modern periods, c. 700–1800, varied based on local conditions, but spring food shortages occurred across different agricultural regions, suggesting that seasonal hunger was a systematic feature of medieval food systems rather than a local problem. The social dynamics of spring hunger reveal how food scarcity affected community relationships and social hierarchies. During autumn abundance, communities could maintain charitable food distribution and social solidarity, but spring scarcity created competition for limited resources that strained social bonds and exacerbated existing inequalities. Medieval Scotland. Food security describes how the poor died of their poverty during food crises, demonstrating how spring hunger disproportionately affected the most vulnerable community members. The psychological impact of predictable spring hunger created cultural patterns that shaped medieval attitudes toward time, planning, and resource management. Knowing that spring represented an annual crisis created forms of chronic anxiety that affected decision-making throughout the agricultural year. Families had to balance immediate consumption against future needs in ways that made every meal a calculation about survival months in advance. The medicinal knowledge that developed around spring nutrition reveals how communities attempted to manage seasonal hunger through alternative food sources. Angelus Press Lenten Practices describes how medieval Christians during Lent consumed bread, vegetables, and some salt. But communities also developed knowledge about edible wild plants, roots, and herbs that could supplement depleted food stores during spring months. The brewing and small beer production challenges during spring compounded morning nutrition problems. Brasseatrix describes brewing processes that required grain allocation, but spring months required difficult choices between using remaining grain for brewing liquid nutrition or preserving it for direct consumption. The failure of brewing capacity during spring meant that communities lost both solid and liquid sources of morning calories. The urban versus rural differences in spring hunger patterns reveal how different communities developed different vulnerabilities to seasonal food shortages. Rural communities had more direct access to wild food sources and agricultural production, but were more dependent on their own harvest success. Urban communities had access to trade networks and stored foods, but were more vulnerable to market price increases and supply disruptions. The international trade responses to spring hunger demonstrate early forms of food security cooperation between regions. CEPR, Famine and Climate, describes how pre-industrial famines occurred at times of high population pressure on resources and were triggered by extreme weather events. But communities also developed trade relationships that could provide emergency food supplies during spring crises. But perhaps most revealing about spring hunger is how it exposed the fundamental contradictions in medieval breakfast culture. The season when people most needed morning nutrition, when their bodies were depleted from winter scarcity and faced increased demands from spring agricultural work, was precisely when religious, economic, and technological constraints made morning food least available. The cruel mathematics of spring survival required medieval people to perform their most demanding physical labor while operating on their lowest nutritional reserves, creating annual cycles of systematic weakening that affected individual health, community productivity, and civilization's overall capacity for development and growth. How did medieval communities develop strategies to survive the predictable crisis of spring?
Hunger?
What innovations and adaptations allowed them to bridge the gap between autumn abundance and summer harvest, while maintaining the religious and social restrictions that made morning nutrition so problematic? The spring hunger that characterized medieval Europe wasn't a failure of planning or a consequence of unexpected disaster. It was the inevitable result of technological, economic, and social systems that guaranteed seasonal starvation as surely as they guaranteed seasonal harvests. Every aspect of medieval food infrastructure, from grain storage to preservation techniques to transportation networks, was designed in ways that concentrated food availability in autumn and winter while creating systematic scarcity during the months when agricultural work demanded maximum physical energy. The storage technologies available to medieval communities reveal the mathematical certainty of spring hunger. Medieval Food Storage PDF explains that food that needed to be stored for longer than a few days needed to be preserved to prevent spoilage, but medieval preservation techniques had limited effectiveness over the 8 and 10-month period between harvests. Even successfully preserved foods deteriorated in nutritional value and palatability over winter months, becoming less capable of sustaining spring agricultural work. The granary systems that stored grain for entire communities operated according to principles that guaranteed spring shortfalls. Getting Your Daily Bread PDF reveals that medieval nobles received 2-3 lbs of wheat bread and 1 gall of ale daily, representing massive grain consumption that had to be stored from previous
Harvests.
But storage losses from rodents, moisture, and spoilage meant that grain stores calculated to last through spring actually fell short, creating predictable shortfalls. The transportation infrastructure that might have alleviated regional spring hunger was inadequate for large-scale food distribution. Medieval agriculture. Wikipedia describes medieval farming as dependent on seasonal cycles and local production, but poor roads, limited transportation capacity, and lack of coordination between regions meant that areas with adequate food stores couldn't effectively support areas experiencing spring shortages. The economic systems that governed food distribution created additional structural barriers to spring food security. Europe. Now famine describes how food crises included high prices as well as shortages, but medieval economic structures lacked the financial mechanisms necessary for systematic food assistance. Communities couldn't develop adequate responses to predictable spring hunger because they lacked economic institutions capable of coordinating resource distribution across time and space. The agricultural labor cycles that determined when food was produced created fundamental conflicts with when food was most needed. Medieval agricultural year explains that crops were weeded once or twice in spring and summer, and then harvest began in late July for the winter crop, and in August for other grains. This meant that the most demanding agricultural work occurred precisely when food stores were most depleted, creating systemic misalignment between energy demands and energy availability. The preservation technique limitations that characterized medieval food storage guaranteed deterioration that accelerated during spring months. Medieval food preservation describes various preservation methods including salting, drying, and smoking. But these techniques couldn't maintain food quality indefinitely. Salt-preserved meats became increasingly tough and less nutritious over time, dried foods lost vitamins and became harder to digest, and smoked foods deteriorated in both flavor and nutritional content. The brewing infrastructure that provided liquid nutrition also operated according to cycles that created spring shortages. Medieval brewing describes brewing systems that required grain allocation and specific timing, but spring months coincided with periods when grain stores were lowest and brewing capacity was most limited. Communities faced choices between brewing remaining grain for liquid nutrition or preserving it for direct consumption, creating impossible decisions about resource allocation. The seasonal disease patterns that characterized medieval life compounded spring nutrition problems in ways that made food shortages more dangerous. Winter illnesses weakened immune systems and depleted body reserves precisely when spring food shortages began. Medieval Lent describes how Lenten fasting restrictions coincided with natural food shortages, but sick and weakened populations were least able to tolerate additional nutritional stress. The fuel and heating requirements that competed with food preservation created additional constraints on spring food availability. Medieval preservation methods describes preservation techniques that required heating to remove moisture, but fuel used for food preservation competed with fuel needed for heating, cooking, and other essential activities. Households had to balance preservation needs against immediate survival requirements in ways that often compromised both. The social obligations that governed food distribution created additional pressures on spring food supplies. Medieval food. Safety describes medieval food-sharing practices, but charitable obligations to feed the poor and provide hospitality to travelers created demands on household food stores that couldn't be suspended during spring shortages. Communities were expected to maintain social obligations even when their own food security was threatened. The religious calendar that mandated increased fasting during spring created additional systematic reductions in food consumption precisely when nutritional needs were highest. Traditional Lenten fast describes Lenten restrictions that limited medieval Christians to bread, vegetables, and some salt, but these requirements coincided with the period when stored vegetables were spoiling and grain supplies were lowest. These regional specialization patterns that characterized medieval agriculture created vulnerabilities that affected entire areas during spring food crises. Medieval cuisine. Wikipedia describes how different regions specialized in different agricultural products, but this specialization meant that crop failures in one area couldn't be easily compensated by production from other regions due to transportation and communication limitations. The population growth patterns that characterized medieval Europe created increasing pressure on food systems that exacerbated spring hunger. CEPR famine. Climate describes how pre-industrial famines occurred at times of high population pressure on resources, meaning that successful years that supported population growth created larger populations that were more vulnerable to subsequent spring food shortages. The knowledge preservation systems that maintained agricultural and preservation techniques were inadequate for the complexity of managing year-round food security. Medieval food research describes extensive medieval food knowledge, but this knowledge was often local, oral, and vulnerable to loss during crises. Communities couldn't develop adequate responses to spring hunger because they lacked systematic ways to preserve and transmit complex food management information. The weather prediction and climate management capacities that might have allowed better preparation for spring food crises were essentially non-existent. Frost and famine. Medieval describes how cold winters and late springs were a cause for concern, but medieval communities had no reliable ways to predict weather patterns or adjust agricultural and storage practices based on climate variability. You see, the financial institutions that might have supported emergency food purchases during spring crises were underdeveloped and inadequate for large-scale food security responses. Medieval food economics describes price increases during food crises, but medieval banking and credit systems couldn't provide the financial resources necessary for communities to purchase emergency food supplies during spring shortages. The international cooperation mechanisms that might have coordinated food assistance between regions were minimal and unreliable. Great Famine describes how The Great Famine started with bad weather in spring 1315 and affected multiple countries, but medieval Europe lacked the political and economic institutions necessary for systematic international food assistance during regional crises. The technological innovation systems that might have developed better preservation and storage techniques operated too slowly to address systematic spring hunger. Medieval food technology describes preservation methods that remained essentially unchanged for centuries, but the systematic nature of spring food shortages should have created incentives for technological development that somehow failed to produce adequate solutions. The urban planning and infrastructure development that might have supported better food distribution and storage were inadequate for managing seasonal food security. Medieval urban food describes urban food systems, but medieval cities lack the infrastructure necessary for maintaining adequate food supplies during spring shortages, creating vulnerability that affected entire urban populations. But perhaps, most tellingly, the systematic nature of spring hunger reveals how medieval civilization had organized itself in ways that guaranteed annual cycles of malnutrition and suffering. The infrastructure of medieval life, agricultural, economic, social, and religious, operated according to principles that made spring starvation not an unfortunate accident, but an inevitable feature of how society functioned. The predictability of spring hunger meant that every medieval community knew that March and April would bring food shortages, yet the same systems that created these shortages prevented communities from developing adequate responses. How did medieval Europe manage to sustain itself through centuries of predictable annual starvation? What adaptations and innovations allowed civilization to continue despite infrastructure that guaranteed systematic seasonal suffering? The ultimate paradox of medieval spring hunger wasn't that it occurred, it was that civilization not only survived it, but somehow flourished despite it. The same months that brought systematic food shortages also brought the agricultural labor that would create the next year's harvest, the construction projects that built Europe's greatest monuments, and the intellectual and artistic work that defined medieval culture. Spring starvation didn't stop medieval development, it shaped it, creating forms of human resilience and adaptation that sustained entire civilizations through centuries of predictable annual suffering. The demographic evidence of spring mortality reveals the true cost of seasonal hunger on medieval populations. Great Famine of 1315-1317 describes how Europe did not fully recover for several years after crop failures, but even normal years showed elevated death rates during spring months. Europe. Now, famine describes medieval food crises as including deaths, as well as high prices. But these deaths were concentrated during spring months when accumulated malnutrition combined with increased physical demands and depleted immune systems. The labor productivity implications of spring hunger affected every aspect of medieval economic development. Medieval agricultural year describes spring as requiring intensive agricultural work, including plowing, planting, and early crop maintenance. But this critical labor was performed by workers operating on depleted nutritional reserves and minimal morning nutrition. The agricultural foundation of medieval civilization was built by people working at reduced physical capacity during the most crucial months of the agricultural year. The construction achievements of medieval Europe, cathedrals, castles, bridges, and urban infrastructure were accomplished despite systematic spring malnutrition that affected the workers who built them. Medieval construction describes elaborate building projects, but the stone carvers, masons, carpenters, and laborers who created these monuments were working during spring months when their physical strength was systematically undermined by food shortages and breakfast restrictions. The intellectual and artistic achievements of medieval culture emerged from minds that were operating under the metabolic stress of chronic spring malnutrition. Medieval monks' diet describes monastic intellectual life, but the monks who copied manuscripts, developed philosophical systems, and created illuminated artworks were doing so while experiencing the cognitive effects of seasonal undernutrition, combined with religious breakfast restrictions. The military achievements of medieval Europe, crusades, territorial expansion, and defensive campaigns were accomplished by armies that experienced annual cycles of spring weakness. Medieval military food describes military provisions, but medieval armies conducted spring campaigns with soldiers whose physical capacity was systematically reduced by months of winter food shortages and the absence of adequate morning nutrition. The key technological innovations that emerged from medieval civilization were developed despite the cognitive and physical constraints imposed by systematic spring hunger. Medieval food technology describes preservation and agricultural techniques, but the craftsmen, inventors, and agricultural innovators who developed these technologies were working with minds and bodies that were chronically undernourished during the spring months when much innovation and development occurred. The urban development that characterized later medieval Europe occurred despite predictable spring food shortages that affected entire city populations. Medieval urban food describes urban food systems, but medieval cities expanded and developed despite annual cycles of food insecurity that should have prevented population concentration and urban growth. The trade networks that connected medieval Europe developed despite transportation and communication systems that were inadequate for managing seasonal food distribution. Medieval trade food describes commercial relationships, but merchants and traders operated within systems that couldn't effectively respond to predictable spring food shortages, yet somehow maintained commerce and development despite these systematic failures. The population growth that characterized much of medieval Europe occurred despite annual mortality spikes during spring months. Population and famine describes how pre-industrial famines occurred at times of high population pressure on resources, but medieval populations continued to grow despite experiencing predictable annual cycles of food stress that should have limited demographic expansion. The cultural and religious developments that defined medieval civilization emerged from communities that experienced annual cycles of systematic hunger. Medieval religious fasting describes religious practices that added to spring food restrictions, but medieval Christianity developed its most sophisticated theological and institutional systems despite operating within communities that experienced predictable annual malnutrition. The adaptation strategies that allowed medieval communities to survive spring hunger reveal remarkable human creativity in developing survival mechanisms. Foraging medieval describes how people were reduced to a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, trapping wild animals and foraging for pig nuts, berries, but communities also developed systematic knowledge about wild food sources that could supplement depleted stores during spring months. The social cooperation mechanisms that sustained communities through spring crises created forms of mutual assistance that strengthened social bonds even during periods of resource competition. Medieval food sharing describes food distribution practices, but communities also developed informal networks of mutual support that helped vulnerable members survive spring hunger through shared resources and collective survival strategies. The psychological adaptations that allowed medieval people to cope with predictable annual hunger created cultural patterns that emphasized endurance, delayed gratification, and community solidarity. Medieval psychology describes spring as the most dangerous time of year, but medieval culture developed rituals, narratives, and social practices that helped people psychologically navigate predictable periods of extreme hardship. The economic innovations that emerged from managing seasonal food security created early forms of risk management and resource allocation that influenced later economic development. Medieval food economics describes price fluctuations during food crises, but communities also developed credit systems, storage cooperatives, and mutual insurance arrangements that helped manage seasonal food insecurity. The agricultural innovations that attempted to address spring hunger created technological developments that improved long-term food security. Medieval agriculture describes agricultural systems, but medieval farmers also developed crop rotation techniques, improved storage methods, and better preservation practices in response to spring food shortages. The political developments that emerged from managing seasonal food crises created governmental institutions and policies that addressed food security as a public responsibility. Medieval food policy describes bread regulations and price controls, but medieval governments also developed taxation systems, emergency response procedures, and international cooperation mechanisms that attempted to address systematic food shortages. The religious and philosophical developments that emerged from experiencing annual cycles of hunger created theological systems that found meaning in suffering while developing practical approaches to community survival. Medieval religious food describes Lenten practices, but medieval Christianity also developed charitable institutions, mutual aid societies, and theological frameworks that supported community resilience during predictable hardship. The medical and nutritional knowledge that developed from managing spring hunger created understanding of seasonal health patterns and dietary requirements that influenced later scientific development. Medieval medicine food describes medieval food safety practices, but communities also developed detailed knowledge about seasonal nutrition, medicinal plants, and health management that helped people survive annual cycles of food stress. The international relationships that developed from managing regional food crises created diplomatic and commercial networks that connected medieval Europe despite transportation and communication limitations. International medieval food describes famines as regional events, but communities also developed trade relationships and mutual assistance agreements that created early forms of international cooperation in food security. But perhaps most remarkably, the legacy of medieval spring hunger reveals how human societies can develop extraordinary resilience and adaptation when confronted with systematic challenges to basic survival. The forms of community cooperation, technological innovation, and cultural creativity that emerged from centuries of predictable annual starvation created foundations for later European development that persisted long after improved agricultural and preservation technologies eliminated seasonal hunger. The great cathedrals of medieval Europe were built by hands that shook from spring hunger. The manuscripts that preserved classical knowledge were copied by minds operating under chronic malnutrition. The agricultural innovations that would eventually eliminate seasonal starvation were developed by farmers who experienced that starvation annually. The political institutions that created modern European governance emerged from communities that had learned to cooperate through predictable cycles of shared suffering. The architectural achievements of medieval Europe, Gothic cathedrals with their soaring spires, massive stone castles built to last centuries, intricate bridges spanning major rivers, were all constructed during a period when the workforce experienced systematic spring malnutrition. Medieval construction projects describes the elaborate planning required for major building projects, but the masons, carpenters, and laborers who lifted massive stones and carved intricate details were doing so with bodies weakened by months of inadequate nutrition. The artistic masterpieces that defined medieval culture emerged from workshops where artisans experienced annual cycles of physical weakness. The illuminated manuscripts with their microscopic detail, the metalwork requiring precise hand control, the textile arts demanding sustained concentration, all were created by craftspeople whose fine motor skills and sustained attention were compromised by chronic spring malnutrition and the absence of morning nutrition. The philosophical and theological systems that shaped medieval thought were developed by minds operating under metabolic stress that modern neuroscience recognizes as significantly impairing cognitive function. Medieval monastic life describes the intellectual work of monasteries, but the monks who developed complex theological arguments and preserved classical learning were doing so while experiencing the cognitive effects of systematic undernutrition. The agricultural expansion that supported medieval population growth occurred despite annual cycles of spring hunger that should have limited agricultural productivity. Medieval agricultural development describes intensive spring field work, but this crucial agricultural labor was performed by workers whose physical capacity was systematically reduced precisely when agricultural success demanded maximum effort. The commercial networks that connected medieval Europe developed despite transportation, systems that couldn't effectively manage seasonal food distribution. Medieval trade systems describes market relationships, but merchants and traders created extensive commercial networks despite operating within systems that couldn't prevent predictable annual food crises in their own communities. The demographic resilience that allowed medieval Europe to recover from major famines reveals extraordinary human adaptability to extreme nutritional stress. The Great Famine Recovery describes how Europe did not fully recover for years after the 1315-1317 crisis, but the fact that recovery occurred at all demonstrates remarkable population resilience despite experiencing catastrophic food shortages. On top of already existing seasonal malnutrition, the cultural innovations that emerged from medieval civilization, new forms of music, literature, art, and social organization, developed within communities that experience predictable annual cycles of physical and psychological stress from food insecurity. Medieval culture and food describe spring as dangerous months, but medieval culture created new art forms, literary traditions, and social practices despite operating under chronic nutritional stress. The technological developments that would eventually eliminate seasonal hunger emerged from communities that experienced that hunger annually. Medieval food technology describes preservation methods, but innovations in storage, preservation, and agricultural techniques were developed by people whose physical and cognitive capacity was systematically impaired by the very problems they were trying to solve. The educational institutions that preserved and transmitted knowledge operated despite annual cycles of malnutrition that affected both teachers and students. Medieval educational systems describes monastic education, but schools, universities, and informal learning networks functioned despite operating within communities where spring hunger was predictable and severe. The military innovations that shaped medieval warfare emerged from armies that experienced annual cycles of reduced physical capacity. Medieval military technology, strategy, and organization developed despite being implemented by soldiers whose strength and endurance were systematically compromised during spring campaigns. The urban planning and infrastructure development that supported medieval city growth occurred despite annual food security crises that should have prevented population concentration. Medieval urban development describes city food systems, but medieval urbanism succeeded despite lacking adequate infrastructure for managing predictable seasonal food shortages. The legal and governmental institutions that created modern European political systems emerged from communities that had learned to cooperate through shared experiences of systematic hardship. Medieval governance and food describes food regulations, but medieval political development occurred within societies that had developed forms of mutual assistance and collective decision-making in response to predictable annual crises. The international relationships that connected medieval European communities developed despite each region experiencing internal food security challenges that should have prevented external cooperation. International medieval relations describes regional famines, but diplomatic, commercial, and cultural networks developed despite systematic internal challenges to community stability. The religious innovations that shaped medieval Christianity emerged from communities that found meaning in systematic suffering while developing practical approaches to survival. Medieval religious adaptation describes Lenten practices, but medieval religious institutions also created charitable networks, mutual assistance systems, and community support structures that helped people survive annual hardships. The scientific and medical knowledge that developed from managing seasonal health crises created understanding that influenced later medical development. Medieval medical knowledge describes food safety practices, but medieval communities also developed detailed understanding of seasonal health patterns, nutritional requirements, and medical treatments that emerged directly from managing annual cycles of malnutrition. The social innovations that allowed communities to survive spring hunger created forms of cooperation and mutual assistance that influenced later social development. Medieval social cooperation describes survival strategies during food crises, but communities also developed systematic approaches to resource sharing, collective work organization, and mutual support that created models for later social organization. But perhaps the most profound legacy of medieval spring hunger is what it reveals about human capacity for adaptation, innovation, and community building under extreme constraints. The civilization that emerged from centuries of predictable annual starvation created institutions, technologies, and cultural practices that not only enabled survival but laid foundations for later European development that eliminated the very conditions that had shaped their creation. The Gothic cathedrals that still inspire wonder today were built by communities that experienced annual hunger. The universities that became centers of learning were founded by societies that systematically restricted morning nutrition. The legal and political institutions that created modern European governance emerged from communities that had learned to cooperate through shared hardship. The agricultural and preservation technologies that eventually eliminated seasonal starvation were developed by people who experienced that starvation personally. Medieval Europe's response to spring hunger demonstrates that human societies can not only survive systematic challenges to basic needs, but can use those challenges as catalysts for innovation, cooperation, and development that creates lasting contributions to human civilization. The forms of community resilience, technological creativity, and social organization that emerged from medieval food insecurity created foundations for later development that persisted long after improved agricultural techniques eliminated seasonal hunger. The harvest of human endurance that medieval Europe reaped from centuries of spring starvation wasn't just survival. It was the creation of new forms of human civilization that demonstrated extraordinary capacity for adaptation, innovation, and cooperation under the most challenging circumstances. The empty stomachs of medieval spring mornings somehow nourished the development of institutions, technologies, and cultural practices that shaped European civilization for centuries. In the end, the cruel mathematics of medieval spring hunger reveals something profound about human resilience. When basic survival becomes challenging, people don't simply endure, they innovate, cooperate, and create new forms of civilization that transform their challenges into the foundations for future development. The spring hunger that medieval Europe experienced annually for centuries created not just suffering, but the human adaptations that would eventually eliminate that suffering while leaving lasting contributions to human knowledge, technology, and social organization. The medieval spring that was indeed the cruelest month ultimately became the season that demonstrated humanity's greatest capacity for turning systematic hardship into systematic innovation, creating forms of community resilience that sustained civilization through its darkest periods while building foundations for its greatest achievements. You have now journeyed through nearly 22,000 words exploring the mundane yet fascinating world of medieval breakfast culture, or rather, the systematic absence of it. From the religious prohibitions that made morning eating a sin, through the bread that became both sustenance and spiritual practice, to the small beer that provided liquid survival, and finally to the spring seasons that tested human endurance. To its limits, these four interconnected stories reveal how medieval Europe built one of history's great civilizations while systematically depriving itself of morning nutrition. This exploration of boring history has shown us that the most ordinary aspects of daily life, what people eat, when they eat it, and why they might choose not to eat at all, can reveal profound truths about human adaptability, social organization, and the complex relationships between survival, spirituality, and civilization. Medieval breakfast culture wasn't just about food. It was about how entire societies can organize themselves around principles that seem to contradict basic biological needs, yet somehow find ways to flourish despite, or perhaps because of, those constraints. The empty stomachs that greeted each medieval dawn carried within them the seeds of remarkable human innovation. The development of preservation techniques, brewing technologies, social cooperation systems, and community resilience networks that would shape European civilization for centuries. In choosing spiritual purity over morning nutrition, medieval Europe accidentally created some of humanity's most sophisticated survival technologies and social institutions. Perhaps most remarkably, this history of systematic breakfast deprivation reveals that human societies can transform their greatest challenges into their most lasting achievements. The same religious restrictions, economic constraints, and seasonal hardships that made medieval mornings so difficult also created the innovations, institutions, and cultural practices that would eventually eliminate those very difficulties. So, the next time you wake up and reach for your morning coffee, toast, or whatever else breaks your fast, remember the centuries of empty medieval stomachs that made your simple morning meal possible, and perhaps find a moment of gratitude for living in an age when breakfast is no longer mostly just hope.